a couple of kids together. Let's go! On a summer evening, what a lovely evening, Johnny gave his girl a ride. There in the moonlight, oh what a moonlight. She kept saying no sir as he cuddled closer, asking her to be his bride. He kept insisting, she kept resisting, till Johnny finally cried, oh let's get together, let's get together. He, oh gosh, oh gee, I love you and you love me. Why do you tarry? Why don't we marry? We'll get along like a couple of kids together. Let's get together, let's get together. I'll go anywhere you say, providing that you go my way. I'll give the orders while you take in boarders. We'll get along like a cat and a dog together.
That's what. Oh fuck.
All right, we're gonna cut briefly here. Master's up. All 3 mics are hot.
How's the hair looking? Looks good. Do the back. Do quick. Yeah, good. Hand down when not on mic. Yeah. Hi. Thanks everyone for joining us here for our first online Odd Salon. I'm Annetta Black.
And I'm Trey Balchowski, and we are the co-founders of Odd Salon and your hosts for this evening. This is our first online Odd Salon, but it is far from our first rodeo. Tonight, we have 6 stories of the odd corners of history, art, science, and adventure, and our speakers are experts and amateurs alike.
In February, we kicked off our 7th season of salons in San Francisco with 400 people in the house. We had so many people that we had to turn people away at the door. That feels like a lifetime ago at this point. But Odd Salon has always been so much more than a stage show. It is a real-world community made up of our speakers and our fellows and the regulars who have been raising glasses with us for more than half a decade. And today, we don't know when we get to see your faces again.
This pandemic has forced us to adapt. So Annette and I are coming to you live from a tiny town in Northern California. Our speakers have pre-recorded their talks and from their homes on both coasts and are in the chat, so say hello and ask them questions. But we want to keep some of our traditions alive. So get a drink ready. You're going to need it for all the toasts throughout the evening. And we invite you to get loud, scream, science, and ships, or write it in all caps in the comments. You can tweet and gram. We encourage you to take screenshots and share them. And please, invite your friends to watch.
This thing is only possible because of our amazing humans. John Adams is our technical producer tonight, and Alexander walked us through Baby's first video editing. Thank you so much. None of the problems are his fault. They are my fault. Melvin built us this beautiful set, and Rebecca let us film here. Thank you to all of you. In the chat, you can look for Odd Salon Fellows Michael Broadhead and Egan Hervella, and Steen is the voice of Odd Salon.
We're vamping. What's going on?
I guess we're having some exciting technical problems.
We've never had those before. Our printers haven't gone out. Our speakers haven't totally deleted their slides. Okay, wait, we did that, didn't we?
We did do that. I did that. I deleted Lilia's entire slideshow.
Are we still? What's going on?
We have audio and no picture.
Oh, that's exciting. Okay, so this is audio and no picture. This is like when in 2014, we used to routinely have the projector turn off halfway through the show, and we couldn't figure out why that was happening.
And I would do interpretive dances, except I would do an interpretive dance now, and no one would see it.
Sad.
It's sad.
Very sad.
We also deleted Lilia's slides once, her entire slides about the polio, and she gave a talk without any visuals.
Yeah, it was amazing. She did a really good job.
So we're hoping at some point that we get video back, or maybe we just go. Okay, I think we just go and move forward because technical difficulties are on the bingo card.
They are, in fact, on the bingo card, so we're just going to go ahead and move along. So in the chat, you can look for Michael Broadhead and Egan Hervella. They're going to be the admins in our chat, and Steen is the official voice of Odd Salon tonight. Please be nice to them in the chat.
Other members of our community are helping out tonight, but also they've been helping out through this crisis. They've been making masks and delivering meals to those in need and raising money. And we also have members of our community that have been touched by the darker elements of this pandemic, the death and financial loss, and they are facing uncertain futures. Here's the deal. The flames are real. So, before we start anything tonight, we want to thank you, everyone who's doing their best to be resilient right now, and acknowledge everyone who is struggling. We see you, you can't see us, and we're with you.
We'd also like to take a moment to thank our sponsor. This has really helped make us be able to make the transition from live events to this online test drive. I'd like to thank Holla Vista. It's a brand new, super beautiful game with an Art Deco inspired aesthetic created by one of our very own fellows, Nadia Lev. You can find the link in the comments, Steen. And with that, I think we are ready to do this thing.
Perhaps not. Maybe.
Wait, maybe we need to pull up that bingo card.
Oh.
And think about some of the things that are on the bingo card.
Can we even do that from here?
Hold before invocation and keep.
Okay.
Do we have any of the cocktail recipes handy?
Nope. I mean, we can talk about gin and tonics. It's a pretty easy one. There's 2 ingredients.
Wait, there was... So
And I think we're just gonna jump into it. Yeah, should we do that?
I think so. So we were just about to say we're ready for this and anything could happen, which it already has. So you can refer to your bingo card. You can already probably check off a couple of boxes. And if everybody has a cocktail, we're ready to do this.
Here we go. Okay. So it probably doesn't surprise any of our regulars that A, we're having technical difficulties, and B, that we, the founders of Odd Salon, have a long-standing curiosity for the dark times surrounding plagues, pandemics, and mass-scale human loss. We can be relied upon to answer the question, where are you from? With a long-winded story to Lyft drivers that really don't want to know about the San Francisco plague outbreak, or to be waving our hands wildly at cocktail parties when we could go to cocktail parties about bad idea plague cures because we can't be trusted to have polite conversation. When we travel, we seek out plague monuments and ossuaries and beautiful cemeteries. And while this may seem like a morbid fascination from the outside, for us, it's about learning from those who survived and gaining a little perspective, because perspective is important.
Hi everyone, thanks for showing up for our first ever Odd Salon online salon. I'm Annetta Black.
And I'm Trey Balchowski, and we're the co-founders of Odd Salon and your curators and hosts for tonight. Now this is our first online Odd Salon, but it is far from our first rodeo. We've been doing this for 7 years in front of live audiences in real life. Who's new? So I can't actually see anybody. There's probably a lot of people new that I'm really excited. So welcome And Odd Salon is a boisterous cocktail hour lecture series where we highlight stories from the odd corners of history, art, science, and adventure. Our speakers are experts and amateurs alike. It's also a real-world community with chapters in San Francisco and New York.
So in February, we kicked off our 7th year in San Francisco with an opening night with 400 people. It was so crowded, we had to close the doors and turn people away. But now that feels like a lifetime ago, and we're not really sure when we're going to be able to see you in person again. But importantly, Odd Salon is not just a stage show. Odd Salon is a real-world community made up of our speakers and our fellows and the regulars who have been showing up for half a decade to raise a glass with us.
But like most of your favorite events and our favorite events, this pandemic has forced us to adapt. And tonight, we're doing this in a virtual way. Annetta and I are coming to you live from a very small town in Northern California. Our speakers pre-recorded their talks at home on both coasts, and they'll be in the chat so you can ask them questions and check out their research rabbit holes. But there are some things we really want to keep the same, some traditions from our live show that we're going to try to carry over to the virtual show. So, get a drink ready, because we're going to be raising toasts throughout the evening. And this has never been a quiet event, so we don't want it to be quiet in this format. We invite you to scream, "Science!" and "Ships!" at your screen and type it in all caps in the comments. We invite you to tweet and gram and take screenshots and share them, and please invite your friends to watch.
So this thing wouldn't be possible without the small army of volunteers that always makes Odd Salon go. Tonight wouldn't happen without the technical expertise of John Adams, who is our technical producer tonight, or to Alexander Razzo-Myers, who has babysat my first editing session, which has been a lot. And I'd also really like to thank Melvin, who built us this great set, and to Rebecca for letting us take up her space to do this thing. And also we have admins online. You might see the Odd Salon Fellows, Michael Broadhead and Egan Harvella in the chat. And Steen will be the voice of Odd Salon. Be nice to them, everyone.
There's also so many members of our community that have done amazing things during this time of pandemic, from making masks and face shields to delivering meals to those that are at high risk, to raising funds, to starting whole new enterprises that are designed to lift up the most vulnerable in our society. Others in our community have been touched by loss and death, illness, and the devastation of their hard-earned businesses and creative endeavors. And they are facing uncertainty in this time. The flames are real, and we want to take a moment before we do anything else tonight to acknowledge everyone who is doing their best to be resilient right now, and everyone who is struggling and is deeply impacted by this pandemic. We see you, and we are with you.
Before we get things started, I also want to give a special thank you to our sponsor for this Odd Salon Online, Holla Vista, which is a new game. It's a beautiful Art Deco-inspired game by Odd Salon fellow Nadia Lev, which will be debuting soon, and you can check out the details of that at enterhollavista.com. You can see the link in the chat. Thank you so much for helping us make this possible. So with that, we're ready to move on and kick this thing off, and anything can happen. This is, in fact, our first online rodeo, and we have a bingo card, so you can play along at home. Well, that will also be in the chat. We'll see how this whole thing goes, but here we go.
So it shouldn't surprise any of our regulars that we, the founders of Odd Salon, have a long-standing curiosity for the dark times that surround plagues, pandemic, and mass-scale human life, loss of human life. We can be relied upon to talk to unsuspecting Lyft drivers who ask the question, "Where are you from?" and get the answer that includes the San Francisco plague outbreak. Or wave our hands wildly at cocktail parties about the bad idea plague cures, because we cannot be trusted to make polite conversation. We also travel to seek out plague monuments and ossuaries and beautiful graveyards. And while from the outside that might seem like a morbid curiosity, to me and to Annetta, this is really about learning from those who survived and gaining perspective. When Mayor Breed ordered all events canceled, we spent a week clicking the refund button on Eventbrite over and over again and wondering what was to come next. And when San Francisco and New York announced the first wave of the shelter in place, we started rereading our favorite books about plague times, like you do. I turned to the Spanish flu epidemic in San Francisco. It was a widespread flu epidemic across the entire country, and in San Francisco, more than 45,000 cases came, and it killed between 3,000 and 3,500 in the fall of 1918 and the winter of 1919. I turned to the stats and the charts and pored over them, but also to the human stories. It was reading those stories and the timeline of just over 100 years ago that allowed me to mentally prepare for that 3-week shelter in place to extend into a multi-month lockdown. It was reading stories of protesters refusing to wear masks that made me unsurprised when we had similar protests now. And having read the stats and stories of the horrific second wave, I am as mentally prepared as I can be for these dark times to become even darker. This historical context from the Spanish flu in San Francisco and the resilience of the citizens 100 years ago who rose from the flames like the phoenix that was on their city flag, that has lent me a starter kit of resilience for right now. We chose the image of the phoenix for tonight's salon, not because of its appearance on the San Francisco flag, but because of its inherent reminder of rebirth, and perhaps
Hello, my name is J.R. Pepper and I'm one of the New York Odd Salon Fellows. I'm currently quarantined at my home in Brooklyn, New York, which means I'm right in the middle of all this craziness. And means that the appropriate reading material for quarantine should be somebody that had a similar circumstance. So, with that in mind, didst thou readst my blog, the Plague Journals of Samuel Pepys. In the days before social media, blogs, gossip columnists, Us Magazine, and Tell-All Books, people kept journals to describe their day-to-day. But what if your day-to-day involves living in one of the most bizarre and devastating plagues in human history? Samuel Pepys took this opportunity to journal the mundane, the devastation, as well as his womanizing and the local gossip in a series of journals that he wrote from 1660 to 1669. Ta-da, here we go. Samuel Pepys was born February 23rd in 1633 and died in May of 1703. He served as a naval administrator with no maritime or military experience and quickly rose to the ranks because, frankly, he did all the work and administrative stuff that nobody else really wanted to do. It didn't hurt that he actually was buddies with King Charles II and King James II, yada, yada, yada. We don't know him for that. What we do know him for are his extensive journals that he wrote from 1660 to 1669. He kept an extensive private diary that remains one of the most referred to historical documents of all time. The problem, or perhaps the most interesting part about this, is that, well, he didn't really expect anyone to read them. So that means not only did he include all the historical tidbits that are great for your AP history course, it also means that he recorded about his various affairs, both financial and sexual. With that in mind, he also wrote about the everyday, the boring stuff, like playing matchmaker for his neighbors, how much he hated his job, his disappointments at the pubs being closed. Sound familiar? Oh yeah, and also his extensive sex dreams and his consistent cheating on his wife. We'll get back to that later. But he also details silly things like theater reviews. For example, this review from 1662 where he went to the King's Theater to see A Midsummer's Night Dream, in which he describes, "Nor shall I ever see it again, for it is the most insipid, ridiculous play that I ever saw in my life." Seems like he was more of a Marlowe fan. He was also a bit of a sex addict, and he used these journals as a means to explain his various liaisons and sexual proclivities, kind of penthouse letter style for the wig-wearing set. And it was all coded in a specific language of all his own, in which he used a mixture of French and Spanish and an amalgamation of English words to describe the particularly racy parts of his journals. So in case his wife happened to see it, maybe she'd be confused and not pay it any mind. For example, this quote here from 1662 illustrates Samuel Pepys being so aroused by seeing a woman's petticoats that he felt the need to write about it. The woman was Barbara Villiers, who was the Countess of Castlemaine, and he later writes about having that exact erotic dream about her in 1665, in which he describes it as one of the best dreams he ever dreamt, and also that he was admitted to use all of the dalliances with her. Hey, hey. The famed diarist even writes where he was caught diddling the maid in 1668, and this happened so much and this affair was so withstanding that eventually the wife caught him, and shamed though he was, it's the girl, Deb, who lost her job. Oh dearie me, Mr. Samuel Pepys. But the thing is, these personal stories would have slipped through the eyes of everybody. It could have been just like any other little girl's diary, with no historical relevance at all. However, he happened to live through both the Great Plague and the Great Fire of 1666. So his diaries, which are, like I said, of penthouse fame, are also kind of infamous for historians because they include a wide variety of information, including the mundane and the everyday, to give us a better understanding of the life that he was living in and the life that everybody else had during what would be two of the most important parts of British history. He chronicled everything. But before we get there, let's start at the beginning. London was one of the largest cities in all of Europe. In fact, it was also one of the most highly populated, densely populated, in fact. Sanitation was pretty much useless. People got sick all the time, and because people were literally on top of each other, and figuratively, the plague would spread through the town like the plague, hence where the term probably comes from. But the city was also filled with rubbish and waste literally being thrown out the window onto the streets. It was a recipe for disaster. Sanitation is a joke, and healthcare is basically to be cured by thoughts, prayers, and magic. So, yeah, it was a recipe for disaster. And this disaster was warned to them by a comet, which they saw in 1664. Comets and British people tend not to mix. They tend to be a portent of doom. Pepys described in his journal from 1664, "Mighty talk there is of this comet that is seen o' nights, and the king and queen did sit up last night to see it, and did, it seems, and tonight I have thought to have done so too, but it is cloudy." Better luck next time. As a side note, while this is happening, he's writing in his journal detailing how proud he is about the new mirror he bought for the dining room. Like I said, comets and British folk don't mix. For example, in 1066, it is rumored that a comet blazed across the sky and was blamed for the Saxons losing the Battle of Hastings. The marking up on the top of this tapestry supposedly reads, "They marvel at the star." The Great Plague of 1665 was not the first, second, third, or even fourth outbreak of the plague that the British folk would have to deal with. In fact, from 1348 up until 1665, London had over 30 outbreaks of plague, and it's first mentioned in his diaries in May of 1665 and sadly becomes a normal part of his everyday. "Hence to the coffee house with Creed," he writes, "where I have not been in a great while, where all the news is of the Dutch being gone out and of the plague growing upon us in this town." By June of 1665, the plague continues to infiltrate the town, with Sam seeing 2 or 3 houses marked with a giant red cross and the words "Lord have mercy" written upon it. The incubation for the plague could take anywhere between 4 and 6 days. So if you saw one of these doors with the red marking, guaranteed somebody was sick inside and probably not going to get out. In fact, if your kid was sick and you weren't, you were all locked in the house. Never mind this quarantine nonsense. You were all literally locked and tied in the house. If you didn't have it, you were going to get it. People start going into quarantine and their homes become shut up by the plague. However, you would think that this would slow down Sam's libido a little bit. In fact, it does quite the opposite. He totally finds the correlation between sex and death, and debauchery and lechery reign supreme, dear watchers. In fact, it would race wildly through his mind, especially once his wife fled the city as a result of the plague. He writes in July of 1665 when he goes on a pub crawl and picks up some hot young ladies. He writes, "And I to the harp and ball, and there stayed a while talking to Mary, and so home to dinner. After dinner to the Duke of Albemarle's again, and so to the Swan, and there demeurer un peu de temps con la fille," which loosely translates into spending time with a hot chick. "And so to the harp and ball, and alone demeurer un peu de temps baissant la," spending some time kissing or screwing, depending upon your translation. "And so away home, and late to the office about letters, resolving from this night forward to close all my letters, if possible, and end all of my business at the office by daylight, and I shall go near to do it, and put all my affairs in the world in good order. That it is much to be feared how a man can escape having a share with others in it, for which the good Lord God bless me, or to be fitted to receive it." So while he's fooling around with barmaids, he's pretty realistic that this plague could get and kill him too, so he figures he should settle his affairs. At this point, a lot of the rich folk leave the cities. They haul ass. And starting in May, when Pepys begins to write an account of all the people had died, it was 43 people had died of plague in May. By August, over 17,000 had died, killing off nearly 15% of London's population. And there were so many that cemeteries were overcrowded, and carts would come by and say, "Bring out your dead." He begins to write consistently about how desolate the streets are, and complains that some of his favorite pubs are now closed. However, he also describes seeing death on a regular basis, and describes on a trip to Greenwich in 1665 in seeing a coffin in his way. But despite plague doors and body counts, life's daily rituals continued. For example, weddings. Things still happen, despite the fact of the devastation. He writes above about witnessing an actual wedding during all of this. And then he also writes how profitable plague times have been for him. He's making mad money during all of this, and he has never lived so merrily as he has done during plague time, as his net worth goes up. January of 1665, his wife also writes that she's so bored that she's redecorating their bedroom. And then the fire, the Great London Fire of 1666, at 1 a.m. on a Sunday morning in a bakery in Pudding Lane, because of course it's named Pudding Lane. It is possibly to have been caused by a spark from an oven, and it became spread throughout the town really quickly because it was a particularly dry summer in London that year. And again, we've got people living on top of each other. It burned from September 2nd up until September 6th and destroyed over 70,000 homes, although remarkably, they say that only 6 people had died. However, it should be noted that those 6 people were probably the only people that were recorded. Anybody that died that was poor, they probably just didn't write about it. He describes the fire as, "so near the fire as we could for smoke, and all over the Thames, with one's face in the wind. You were almost burned with a shower of fire drops." And he continues to write at length about how devastating and simultaneously beautiful this fire was. While everybody runs to their home when a fire happens, you try to grab the thing that means the most to you. And for most people, that means things like photo albums. But in lieu of photography not even being invented yet, Samuel Pepys runs and grabs the following objects: his expensive wine, his papers, his gold, oh yeah, and a giant, massive wheel of Parmesan cheese, which he buries in the ground so nobody else can get it. Cheese was stupid expensive and also a sign of how wealthy he really was. We don't have anything written in the records, though, to say as to whether or not he was able to dig the cheese up and sample it at a later time. His last entry from 1669, he describes once again flirting with women and other such proclivities, and I'm going to use the term loosely. And going to, once again, another pub, the World's End, a drinking house by the park, and there merry and so home late. His last entry in May of 1669 is because Samuel Pepys thought he was going blind. Thanks to the work of Samuel Pepys, we have a full-length description of the world around the Great Plague of 1665, in a way that sounds very similar to kind of what we have going on outside these days during the quarantine of 2020. And the Great Fire of London and the details surrounding the plague are downright scary how similar they are. The pubs closing up, the lack of theater options, seeing coffins on a daily basis. I live in New York. I've been seeing this all the time. So, yeah, the thing is that it also shows an astounding amount of resilience. We lived through it once, we wrote about it, we're living through it again, and we'll write about it again, and we'll chronicle it for people for future generations. Subsequently, his Dear Penthouse-style entries, there were so many of which that it's filled not one, not two, but several BBC radio programs and television shows. His diaries show the devastation of two of the most gutting events in all of British history, but it also shows that resilience that the human spirit is known for. And despite it all, life finds a way. But when you write about these things in your own quarantine experience, keep in mind that these journals don't show Sam in the most flattering light. He was a bit of a hound dog, constantly cheating on his wife, and was really more obsessed about the money he was making. However, dear watcher, when writing your own account of your time in quarantine, be careful what you write, because those journals will tell future generations everything they need to know about the quarantine and the coronavirus responses. But they might not need to know about how you broke quarantine for sex, all the tacos you ate without wearing any pants, or how much you enjoy the Tiger King. You might not want people to know that, because right now, history has its eyes on us. So, raise a glass to the world we live in now, and how we can make it better. Cheers, mates. Stay safe. May all your wine be tasty.
Hello everyone, my name is Alexander Razzo Myers, and I'm a San Francisco Odd Salon Fellow, coming to you from Forestville, California in Sonoma County. Art is not created in a vacuum, and the Seventh Seal is not a story without precedent, nor does it portray itself to be one. The plague of the 14th century is well known, and certainly not forgotten, though some of the elements are more familiar than any of us could have ever wanted to personally experience. The plague, though, that I speak of is the Black Death that roamed through Europe in the 14th century. Wretched, terrible, destructive year, the remnants of the people alone remain. From the Decameron, it first betrayed itself by the emergence of certain tumors in the groin or the armpits, some of which grew as large as a common apple, others as an egg. Of many others who died at home, the departure was hardly observed by their neighbors, until the stench of the bodies carried the news. Plague, not great. Perhaps somehow, though, it only follows that Bergman, the son of a Lutheran minister who helped move corpses out of a hospital into the chapel with the hospital's gardener as a teen, was supposed to make a picture about a plague within a crusade so stupid, only an idiot could have invented it. The only mechanism of ruin on the scale of the Black Death lurked in the creation of a bomb that could create mutually assured destruction. Atomic war. Also not great. The Seventh Seal wasn't exactly running away from being a discourse on the greater fragility of humanity in 1957. A film that would be set to contemplate the issues of humanity before the neat chrome fins arrive in 1959 to distract people from the specter of impending doom that might possibly come but never did. Crusade so stupid only an idiot could have invented it neatly describes the tone of futility and frustration that film production frequently has. For how I remember it now as a film of high art. The Seventh Seal started off as a reasonably special, yet not particularly special script for a picture. Bergman and the head of Svensk film industry differ as to the enthusiasm for the project. Bergman saying that it took some coaxing, and the studio head, in typical studio head fashion, regardless of being from Hollywood or Sweden, insists for the historical record that he always knew it was going to be a special film and instantly was sold on it. One is far more inclined to believe Bergman's account of the reticent studio head, and the established record of moderate budget and tight shooting schedule confirms the director's recollection. You have 35 days and $150,000. Welcome to the motion pictures, folks. Create a timeless work of art in 35 days and $1.33 million in today's money. Part of this was that unions in Sweden, for the film industry, were not as strong as they were in the United States. Jobs were less specialized, people did more multitudes of jobs, cut costs. Actors made far more meager salaries in the United States, even by 1957 standards, and certainly by modern standards. Rushing through production with a heavy camera blimped for sound, hiding the sound of the gears and motors and whirring of the film itself and the sprockets running through the camera that make the miracle and the magic of the motion picture camera. The crew had to haul the 200-pound camera down through the stony beach onto the rocks for the shots that we've all seen. They didn't exactly relish the job. Certain elements of the Seventh Seal were nearly impossible to outrun. Bergman, with his love of German expressionist cinema, borrowed the hard 1930s graphic contrast in the film of death and existential contemplation, unquestionably using the Black Death as a convenient crutch to create a picture which sprang from the possibility of a tragedy worse than the Black Death, the age of the thermonuclear weapon. Stage actors, journeymen who knew how to make a show, and mostly part of the Bergman stage troupe, certainly sped production. Accounts widely mention the credit given to talent that was familiar, knew the director's methods, and could make the 35 days a tolerable window, even if the days were 14 hours long in many cases. Gaunt and weathered, the look of Max von Sydow as the knight, surprisingly only 27 at the time, gave the film an unmistakable hero, the Crusader, with his own Sancho Panza, who was a far more questionable figure in The Squire, riding along to tilt with death the iconic gaunt figure across the chessboard. Good and evil in opposition are not unfamiliar to stories in classical history or literature. Those two frequently ride in the same train, but in different cars, and are certainly not unfamiliar to Bergman, who would sharpen the epic battle again in The Virgin Spring, only 3 years later. Cinematographer Gunnar Fischer recalls the shooting as adventurous. On the subject of the lighting for the most famous of all scenes in the film, in which the knight plays chess with death, Fischer remarked, "You can see that each of them has a 2-kilowatt light behind him, illuminating his profile. People said to me that has to mean there are 2 suns. Yes, that is quite right, I said. But if you can accept death sitting and playing a game of chess, then you can also accept 2 suns. Death comes as the sun rises. I am a knowing, says death. As Bergman said of the production, the image of the dance with death beneath the dark cloud was achieved at hectic speed because most of the actors had finished for the day, assistants, electricians, and a makeup man, and about 2 summer visitors, who never knew what it was all about, had to dress up in the costumes of those condemned to death. Camera with no sound was set up as the picture shot before the cloud dissolved. The Seventh Seal is a film out of its own time, but also not of its time either. More of the silent era in some ways, asking questions without insisting that our hands need keep a firm grip on embracing reality, lest our little minds are lost in a story that we have to think to follow. Of a story propelling forward in a predictable manner, and still, to be of our own questions of existence, the Seventh Seal poses what we didn't really want to ask. When the film hit U.S. shores, Variety said of it, "Superior technical narrative, impressive lensing and thesping makes this a definite U.S. art house possibility. It would be chancy for more general situations. Say baking a cake, I suppose. It spread out an awesome canvas of human cupidity and purity." Variety noted that it was 96 minutes and 8,500 feet of film. The one-act play Wood Painting that Bergman created, broadcast over the radio in Sweden, became, while Bergman was in hospital with stomach ailments, into its first draft known as Night and Death, and the Seventh Seal as we knew it hit the shores a year later, after a mixed to chilly critical reception in Sweden, the gist of which was generally, go back to comedy. Though one can find the cinematography looking a bit routine these days compared to many noir and even 1960s television shows that brought the look of Bergman and Fisher to the U.S. in homes via Hitchcock and The Twilight Zone. Bergman said, "Wood Painting gradually became the Seventh Seal, an uneven film which lies close to my heart because it was made under difficult circumstances in a surge of vitality and delight." The film is of a journey. Is there a there? To crudely paraphrase Stein. Chess serves as a clock to see if the journey will be completed before time runs out. Certain extents find the Seventh Seal asking questions that could also be applied to its production and the production of any film in a mist of half-spoken promises and unseen miracles. Could also be applied to making a movie as well. Of course, I can't ignore the parodies. Monty Python's Meaning of Life complained about Americans not shutting up. I suppose I'm not making that any better. Quiet, you Englishmen. You're all so fucking pompous. Der Dove, a short film animated in 1968 at the Academy Awards for Best Short, had Death playing badminton, replete with pig Swedish, and was directed by George Coe, who some of you might recognize. Bill and Ted's Bogus Adventure, where they play Candyland with Death and give Death a wedgie. However, Death playing chess with the Swedish chef from the Muppets is one not to be missed, which Bergman counted as one of his personal favorites. Auteurs are not always, much like the overlooked dark humor of the Seventh Seal, humorless. The film was a touchstone that changed the taste of American audiences and nearly single-handedly created the foreign cinema circuit. The film was a touchstone that changed the taste of American audiences and nearly single-handedly created the foreign cinema circuit. The Seventh Seal is a picture about a journey to see if home, as we recall, as we long for home, is what we recall it to be, extant in our memories, and along the way, who do we meet? And if you cannot kindly wait for death, should you encounter it, its unknowing face will play chess, and it will kindly wait for you. The night's journey of longing for the familiar is a bit more familiar to us now. What do we recall? What are our experiences we now longingly recall from our recent past, the past that we took for granted? What are those unspoken miracles we miss now? But let's not forget what rose from the Black Death, the Renaissance. And the Renaissance was pretty fucking great. Like Bergman, and I'm not to compare myself with the master, I present questions, longing for answers, which you'll only find within the qualia of your own consciousness. That is the enduring gift of Bergman's vitality and light. A toast. To paraphrase Bergman and his night, may our unevenly executed ideas carry us through until we see each other's faces with strawberries and milk again. That warm memory we shall hold on to.
Thanks, Alexander. Christopher Reeves is our next speaker, coming to us from Rhode Island with a story of guerrilla PR for a good cause, or how to get what you want by being a jerk. Thanks, Alexander. Christopher Reeves is our next speaker, coming to us from Rhode Island with a story of guerrilla PR for a good cause, or how to get what you want by being a jerk.
Stepping onto the screen. Alright guys, my remote has broken so many times. This is the last try. I did get it down once, and we're not doing it again after this, so I don't fucking murder anyone. My name is Chris Readst, and I am a fellow of Odd Salon, sheltering in place in the mighty state of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. This is John Early, world famous leper. How an ornery leper scared America's wealthy into funding medical research. It's June 2nd, 1914. You're a news reporter for the Washington Post. You walk into the fashionable Shoreham Hotel in Washington, D.C. to respond to an anonymous tip for a story. You and two other reporters arrive at a hotel room and are greeted by a tall, well-spoken man. This man. He shakes everyone's hands and says, "You have just shaken hands with a leper." One reporter just bursts into tears. You start shaking. The scene devolves into utter chaos. Who is this man? It's John Early, world famous leper. But first, leprosy. Leprosy has been feared for thousands of years. Arabic scholars describe the specific medical condition, naming it Judum, but while translating medical texts into Latin, one Christian monk decided to use the term lepra from the Bible, which was a catch-all for any disease that causes open sores, rashes, lack of feeling, and or deformed or missing body parts. The problem is that lots of other diseases have these symptoms. Missing facial parts in particular are also a symptom of syphilis, which one caught from too much sexy time. A single, lazy editor made leprosy a sin. Visible symptoms of the disease caused victims to be stigmatized as unclean and unworthy of God. Most often they were exiled or shunned completely. Now, in order to preserve their dignity, I will not be showing you photos of real people who suffered from this disease. Leprosy causes deadened nerves, blindness, loss of extremities when they become damaged and get secondary infections. The fear and stigma over leprosy was so strong that people were often treated as if they were already dead. In some places, spouses were granted summary divorces, and the patient's will was immediately executed before the person was exiled. Known lepers were hunted down by law enforcement and shipped to leper colonies in empty boxcars. One man was shipped back and forth between counties who refused to accept him for 2 weeks before a doctor finally entered the car to find that the man had been dead for days. In 1875, a Norwegian physician named Gerhard Hansen isolated the bacterium that causes leprosy. The disease was renamed Hansen's disease, but the stigma still stuck. Hansen's disease is easily treated today with 3 or 4 antibiotics. In the early 2000s, 2 genes were discovered that contribute to a predisposition to infection by Hansen's disease. Only 5% of the human population seems to have these genes. 95% are naturally immune to Hansen's disease, but Hawaiians and the French tend to have the genes to catch it. Even if you have these genes, Hansen's disease is super hard to contract. We do have current cases of Hansen's disease in the southern United States because of the prevalence of French genes in the Creole population, and they catch it from the only other mammal who is affected by Hansen's disease: armadillos. Witness the horror of a live leper! The CDC website actually states, for general health reasons, avoid contact with armadillos whenever possible. Leprosy was a disease that brought out the worst in politicians, whose reactions were to get rid of the person by forced exile to leper colonies, which were effectively prisons. But taking care of exiles costs a lot of money. The conditions alone in many leper colonies were often life-threatening. Early exiles to the colony on the island of Molokai were originally pushed off the side of a ship. Even if they made it to shore, they were only given a small blanket to sleep on and were made to sleep outside on the ground. But as long as they were out of sight, no one would know. Leprosy was known to be one of the least contagious diseases, yet it remained an illegal disease, warranting complete segregation for no reason other than politicians giving in to the stigma of public fear. In 1908, retired Army Corporal John Early goes to the VA hospital in Washington, D.C. to have a doctor look at burns that he sustained while working at a paper mill. He jokingly asks, "Do you think I have leprosy?" The doctor does. A second doctor concurs, and Early is immediately quarantined. He's moved to a tent along the banks of the Potomac behind several fences and under armed guard. John's wife, Lottie, and young son come from their home in North Carolina to see him, and Lottie is told to choose between her husband and her son. Meanwhile, public spectators line up 6 deep along the fences just to be disappointed by the sight of an ordinary-looking man in his 30s. John is kept in a tent for several months, and his family is only allowed to visit for 1 hour each day. Here is a picture of them sitting about 6 feet apart. Eventually, authorities moved John and Lottie into an abandoned home in D.C. where a brick wall is constructed between 2 portions of the house, and an armed officer enforces their separation. John and Lottie sing to each other from their side of the wall at night. After almost a year of quarantine, a curious thing happens. John's leprosy clears up. In order to confirm that John is free of the disease, he will have to be tested in New York, where doctors have hotly contested his prognosis. But no one wants John in their town. He can't go back home. Not to move leper. Leper not to be deported. Won't send leper here. May yet send leper here. Alleged leper sent me here in a boxcar. John tests negative for the disease and is released. Under assumed names, John and Lottie moved to Brooklyn, to Connecticut, to Los Angeles, and finally to Washington State, but their identities are always discovered and they are driven out of each community in turn. Then, John's leprosy comes back. Lottie is now 22 years old with 2 children and has been on the run for 5 years across 5 states since she was 17. She's had enough. John has become abusive. So, Lottie secretly cuts off a piece of John's tissue and sends it to Dr. Hansen himself, who confirms that John has a mild form of the disease with lesions that come and go. John is sent to a leper colony in Tacoma, and Lottie marries another man. John loses his shit. He hires someone in a failed attempt to kill Lottie, and then John disappears. In this time, John has an epiphany. He realizes that Lottie is not to blame, but instead that his troubles arise from the cruelty towards people who suffer from Hansen's disease. So John makes a plan, which brings us back to the Shoreham Hotel. This is where you come in. John shakes your hand, tells you he's a leper, and says, "I called you newspapermen up to my room so that you would write stories about me." For the last 2 weeks, John has been on tour. He spent his pension on a first-class train ticket, stopping in Toronto, New York City, and finally Washington, D.C. He's been to Broadway shows, a baseball doubleheader, fancy restaurants, and has stayed in the very best hotels, like the Shoreham, which is home to the vice president and several senators. He says, "To demonstrate how easy it is for a leper to mingle in cities, I planned my present trip 6 months ago. I knew that it is only when a great truth is set home to the hearts of the people that attention is paid to it. I knew that if I mingled among the well-to-do and the rich and exposed them to contagion, that they would arise out of self-protection and further my plan of a national home." Leper is a derogatory term, but John wears it like a badge. He has the sympathy of the public, and he knows how to use it against politicians that continue to ignore the cruel treatment of people with Hansen's disease. John is white, male, an Army veteran, and has a form of the disease that does not leave him disfigured. He is working his privilege, and he knows it. He publicly insists that a hospital is needed to care for people with Hansen's disease as patients, not as criminals. This same day, the issue of a federal leper hospital comes up in Congress. A bill is approved, and John is sent forcibly to live at the Louisiana leper home near Carville, which is chosen as the site for the new national hospital. The home is in disrepair. The home is in a swamp. After a while, Congress has dragged their feet on approving money to redevelop the hospital and make good on their promise to properly care for the patients. So, John Early escapes again, and again, and again, and again. Each time, he shows up to congressional meetings announcing himself as John Early, the leper. John's antics win both the money and public sentiment to improve the care of people with Hansen's disease. The Louisiana Leper Home is developed into a state-of-the-art hospital and quickly becomes the world's leading research facility for patients with Hansen's disease. John attends the dedication ceremony of the new hospital, where he delivers several choice words about Congress. John lives the rest of his life at Carville, where he is treated for symptoms of PTSD, and he continues to advocate for Hansen's disease patients through writing, by escaping, and by generally being a dick. The Washington Post writes, "His eccentricities have at least served to keep the public apprised of the fact that there is a leprosy problem in the United States." John later writes a 48-page memoir outlining the injustices of man. It is titled, John Early, World Famous Leper. So, oddies, friends, lend me your glass. Here's to using your privilege to harass, harry, and harangue those who would oppress the less fortunate.
Thank you, Chris. Coming up next, we have Isolde Honore, who is the producing curator for the San Francisco chapter of Odd Salon. She's coming to us from Berkeley, California, and telling us the story of preventative medicine and going up against Typhoid Mary with stick figures. Thank you, Chris. Coming up next, we have Isolde Honore, who is...
Thank you for joining me in my living room in Berkeley, California, as we embark on our first digital Odd Salon. My name is Isolde Honore, and I am an Odd Salon Fellow, as well as a producer and curator for the San Francisco Odd Salon chapter. Tonight, as we discuss resilience, I would like to introduce to you Dr. Sarah Josephine Baker, a revolutionary figure in public health and preventative medicine, who through common sense and systematic implementation of modern ideas restructured our approach to treating communicable diseases and innovated the field of child health and hygiene despite considerable obstacles, sexism, pushback, and tons of bureaucratic red tape. When she decided to go into medicine, this idea was met by derision and discouragement. It was considered unwomanly, unfeminine, and no one in her family had ever practiced medicine. It just wasn't done. However, she wanted nothing more than to prove her naysayers wrong. She wrote in her memoir, "When I encountered only argument and disapproval, my native stubbornness made me decide to study medicine at all costs and in spite of everyone." And she did practice medicine. She graduated in 1898, set up her first practice, and in the first year only made $185. Treating New York's downtrodden poor is not lucrative, and she ended up having a career as a medical examiner for the New York Department of Public Health. Now, in 1901, this department was poorly managed, inefficient, and corrupt. When she showed up her first day to a dilapidated building, she remarked, "It reeked of negligence and stale tobacco smoke and slacking." Many of her fellow inspectors were just there for an easy paycheck, but not Dr. Baker. She rolled up her sleeves and dove into her assigned area of treating sick children in Hell's Kitchen, dubbed by other doctors the suicide ward. With 6,000 people crammed in per city block, it was thought to be the most densely populated area in the world. Filthy tenements and slums without adequate ventilation or sanitation, and living in such quarters spread community diseases easily like dysentery, diphtheria, typhus, typhoid fever, measles, and more. Epidemics swept through the neighborhood with startling regularity. And even worse, not just in this poor neighborhood, but throughout New York City, infants were dying at an alarming rate. In the summer, every week, 15,000 infants died of dehydration and diarrhea. And of 1/3 of all the annual deaths in the city, 1/3 of them were children under 5, and most of that amount were infants under the age of 1. And even more frustrating was this prevailing medical attitude that babies always died in the summer and there was no point trying to do anything about it. It seemed hopeless, it seemed futile, and Dr. Cho was astonished that anyone could survive in such awful conditions. And any survival was a stunning display of resilience in the face of such poverty. She worked tirelessly to treat as many cases as she could, but even so, the scope and breadth of the problem seemed impossible. Fortunately, a change was coming to the Department of Public Health. In 1902, a new director was hired who quickly fired all the negligent or incompetent staff. Now, Dr. Joe was diligent, principled, and had great ideas, and quickly rose to the rank of assistant to the Commissioner of Public Health. She was encouraged to go by Dr. S.J. Baker professionally because, oh, a female in an executive position? That simply isn't done, despite the fact that she was actively doing it. The community, however, affectionately referred to her as Dr. Joe. She adopted a signature masculine style in clothing to be taken more seriously professionally, and in her time in public health, she became sort of a specialist for the most difficult cases, and she, in fact, played a crucial role in a famous New York epidemic of typhoid fever, which is easily communicable through contaminated food or water or close proximity to an infected patient. So it made a kind of morbid sense that epidemics of typhoid would sweep through areas like Hell's Kitchen. However, it made less sense that individual cases were popping up in wealthy homes throughout New York. Dr. George Soper had a theory that there was an infected index patient spreading the disease, which led him to suspect Chef Mary Mallon. He thought that she was the first asymptomatic carrier of the disease, a theory which had yet to be proven. So he called the Department of Health to send out a medical examiner to collect blood and urine samples to prove his theory of an asymptomatic typhoid carrier. Enter our heroine, Dr. Josephine Baker, to collect the samples for science and for public health. Dr. Joe tracked Mallon to the home where she worked to make the request, but Mallon summarily refused. Dr. Joe communicated back to HQ to report that she was unable to obtain the samples, and she was told either get them or take Mallon to the hospital by force if necessary. It was necessary. So Dr. Joe returned with a transport ambulance and 2 police officers, and this time Mallon answered the door, lunging forward, attempting to stab Dr. Baker with a cooking fork. Dr. Baker jumped back, colliding into the policeman behind her, and Mary fled and escaped in the chaos. For 2 hours, they searched the house top to bottom until they found footprints leading to the neighboring house. Dr. Baker grabbed 2 more policemen and again conducted an exhaustive search, and after 3 hours they discovered a closet door with ash cans stacked against it, with a minute piece of blue gingham caught in the door frame. Sure enough, Mary Mallon was hiding inside, and she was strong-armed by the police into the ambulance, whereupon, to transport the kicking, screaming, cursing, shouting, cussing, fighting Irishwoman to the hospital, Dr. Joe literally had to sit on Mary the entire ride to the hospital to restrain her in order to collect the specimens to test the theory of an asymptomatic typhoid carrier for science and for public health. And yes, Miss Typhoid Mary was confirmed to be a carrier of the disease, having sickened over 15 people and killing 3 with her delicious desserts and signature peach melba. She never washed her hands. Please wash your hands. This was not Dr. Baker's only standoff with Typhoid Mary, but I'll post that story to something weird. But back to her heroine. As a now prominent figure in public health, she oversaw school examinations, and traditionally, children would be examined and sent home if they had a contagious disease. But this neither treated the disease and ended up reducing school populations by about 80%. So Dr. Joe had to come up with a solution to this. And her novel idea was to assign a nurse at each school to help treat the diseases on the spot. And now it's completely the norm throughout the US to have school nurses, and this entire idea was thanks to Dr. Joe. But again, she wrestled with this problem of high infant mortality. She felt that through better education and outreach, most of these problems could be prevented before they started, and she had an epiphany. The way to keep people from dying from disease, it struck me suddenly, was to keep them from falling ill. Healthy people don't die. That sounds like a completely absurd and witless remark, but at the time it really was a startling idea. So she decided to take this radical idea to her superiors and emerged the first chief of a brand new child health division in New York. But she had to prove herself. She had no staff, she had no budget, but she did have good ideas. And also she had all the school nurses who were out for the summer. So Dr. Joe obtained records of all the newborns in the city and sent out her nurses to instruct the new mothers in a few simple things. First, exclusive breastfeeding, which reduced the incidences of diarrhea, proper ventilation, regular bathing, thin summer clothes to prevent overheating, and fresh air. That was it. And with those 5 changes, the results were shocking. Infant mortality plummeted from 1,500 cases of infant deaths a week to 300 a week. And the city was delighted, and soon the Bureau of Child Hygiene was formed with plenty of funding and Dr. Baker at the helm. As she set out to staff her new agency, she assigned 6 top doctors to the Bureau and was shocked when that very same day they all tendered their letters of resignation to her. They explained that they respected her professionally, but the idea of a male doctor working for a woman, it just wasn't done. So thinking quickly, she had to spin the situation. She told them, "See here, you are really crying before you are hurt. I quite realize you may not like the idea of working under me as a woman, but isn't there another side to this question? I do not know whether I am going to like working with you." And then she challenged the stunned and silent doctors to give it a month's trial before they resigned. And at the end of the month, none of them did. In fact, the Bureau continued to grow and flourish and had many good works under Dr. Joe. So here is a sampling of just a few of her good works. She treated an epidemic of infant blindness. When children were born and caught gonorrhea around the eyes, it caused blindness, which was easily treatable with silver nitrate, but the bottles could be contaminated or the solutions would evaporate to too strong a concentration. So she worked with a lab to develop a foolproof solution of beeswax ampules that contained the correct dosage of silver nitrate droplets. Each tin came with a sterile pin to pierce the ampule, and this reduced the cases in New York City from 300 cases of infant blindness a year to just 3 per year. And it was so effective that these ampules were adopted across the nation and across the world for decades. The next epidemic she treated was the health crisis caused by contaminated milk. She sourced private philanthropic funding to establish 30 safe milk stations in the city. These milk stations also served as a casual sort of education for the poor mothers. Nurses could dole out the milk, then suggest things that mothers could be doing better at home. Dr. Joe leaned hard on the city politicians to support this endeavor and secured even more public funding to establish dozens more milk stations across the city. However, these milk stations proved to be a little too successful. The mayor ended up forwarding Dr. Baker a petition from 30 Brooklyn doctors claiming that the Bureau should be abolished because it was ruining medicine and the medical practice because now there were so few unwell children to treat. She laughed, signed their petition, and penned a quick note. "This is the first genuine compliment I've received since the Bureau was established. I am profoundly grateful for the opportunity to have seen it." And she mailed it back to them. Other things she did, she designed new, easier infant clothing, which were picked up immediately. She started licensing midwives. She also developed efficient record sheets for school examinations that were used for dozens of years after her retirement across the nation. She even took on the cultural challenge of little mothers, who were the girls that had to look after their younger siblings while their own mothers worked. She established the Little Mothers League to teach these little caretakers how to feed, bathe, dress, and play with their little siblings to improve the lot of children throughout the city. Throughout her work in the Bureau, disease and mortality rates had plummeted, and this novel idea of public health education had taken root. By 1916, 5 other states had started their own bureaus of child hygiene, modeled after hers. Dr. Jo never backed down from adversity and dug in her heels to navigate through political machinations and effect social change. She even used the press to further the cause of safer infants across the nation. In 1916, in the midst of World War I, she issued a public statement. She wrote, "It is 6 times safer to be a soldier in the trenches of France than to be born a baby in the United States." This sentiment struck deep into the American consciousness, and soon the population began to clamor for a change. And she had it readily available. She had built an effective model for other states to follow. Dr. Baker had promised herself that if all 48 states adopted a Bureau of Child Health, that she could retire. And by 1923, just 7 years later, they all had. She did retire from the Bureau and was personally credited with saving the lives of more than 90,000 infants in New York City alone, not to mention all the changes that she implemented worldwide. And by her retirement, New York had one of the lowest rates of infant mortality in the nation. So I would like to thank Dr. Jo for her resilience in overcoming archaic traditions of "it just isn't done" or "that's just the way it is." So I would like to raise my glass in a toast to the indomitable spirit of Dr. Jo, to the resilient children of New York, and a reminder to please wash your hands often. Thank you.
Thank you, Isolde. Matt Codner is up next with a story in the grand tradition of Odd Salon stories about dogs, with an incredible tale of the 1925 serum run to Nome, Alaska.
Hello, I'm Matt Codner, and I'm a fellow of Odd Salon, sheltering in place in beautiful Upper Manhattan, New York City. Today I'll be talking with you about the 1925 serum run. When trains, planes, and ships wouldn't do, Siberian Huskies answered the call to deliver antitoxin to the edge of the American Empire against overwhelming odds, covering 674 miles of ice-covered terrain in just 5.5 days to save the lives of children of Nome, Alaska. Now I want to start out by asking, what motivates people to do magnificent things? Why run a marathon or orbit the Earth or charge hundreds of miles through bitter cold on a sled? When people achieve such feats, we often assume lofty motivations for them, that they do it to see what they are capable of, or for fame or self-worth, perhaps to help humanity or individual humans. In this story, 20 skilled humans brave unbelievably frigid, -70-degree Alaska weather to travel nearly 700 miles to save children from a disease. We can speculate that many of them did it, likely because, well, kids and disease is a horrifying prospect. Some because they were the only ones in the place and time with the necessary skills or sense of duty. 2 of those humans achieved overwhelming fame, while 18 of them lived out their lives in relative obscurity in an obscure land. Now I want to ask, what motivates dogs to do magnificent things? What makes a dog want to run a marathon or orbit the Earth or charge hundreds of miles through bitter cold for a cause? In this story, 150 intrepid dogs brave frigid -70-degree Alaska weather to travel nearly 700 miles to save children from a disease. 2 of those dogs achieve overwhelming fame, while 148 of them lived out their lives in relative obscurity. What motivated these dogs? People tend to assign less noble motivations to dogs. They assume that dogs do things out of loyalty or instinct or pack mentality or because they want a biscuit. These assumptions require us to believe that dogs only do great things because they're told to do so or because of their dedication to a human. If that's true, we must examine our own motivations and perhaps start from an assumption that we, too, can only achieve great things because we're expected or told to do so. Throughout our long mutual evolutionary history, dogs have propelled humans into greatness, comforted us during challenging times, and saved our butts when we've really messed up. It could be argued that we as humans could not be the species that we are without dogs. We would be just like all the other animals, if we survived natural selection at all. And Nome, Alaska definitely would not exist without humans screwing up and dogs saving them. The only reason Nome exists is because in 1900, 30,000 washed-up wannabe failed gold prospectors showed up from San Francisco and camped in tents on the beach. I guess it was like Burning Man, but in the snow. They didn't find much gold and they got frozen in for the winter as the Bering Sea freezes solid in October and doesn't melt until April. With no way out, they got frostbitten, died, some drowned from storm surge, and almost all the survivors got on the first ships out the next spring. With about 1,200 residents, it can be challenging for a city dweller to wrap your head around what a tiny town Nome was, and still is. Not only is Nome tiny, but it is also far from anywhere. It is closer to Russia than it is to the next US town. It's 500 miles west of Hawaii, halfway between New York City and Tokyo, 2 degrees south of the Arctic Circle. Then, as now, there are no roads or rail in or out of Nome. There is only sea access 5 months out of the year, and the town is frozen in and cut off from the rest of the world for the other 7 months. Before the October freeze, all supplies come in by ship. In October of 1924, the Alameda made its final supply run before winter and then headed back to Seattle. The town's only doctor, Dr. Curtis Welch, later claimed that he had ordered a resupply of diphtheria serum to replenish his tiny stash that expired 5 years ago and that it never made it on the supply run. He wasn't concerned though, as the town hadn't suffered a diphtheria outbreak to date. On Christmas Eve, Dr. Welch sees a young patient who has a sore throat. He diagnoses it as tonsillitis. When the patient dies soon after, Dr. Welch lists the cause of death as tonsillitis. Over the next few weeks, he would see 4 children die from what he diagnosed as tonsillitis. Finally, in mid-January, when a 5th case of suspected tonsillitis hits, he starts to suspect something more sinister: diphtheria. Diphtheria is nasty stuff. Adults might survive, but it's especially lethal in children. It's a highly contagious bacterial infection that starts with a sore throat and creates a swollen membrane that slowly chokes and suffocates the victim. At the time, only serum was the surefire cure. And what's serum? It's antibodies made from the blood of horses. On January 22nd, when a 5th child is near death, Dr. Welch meets with the mayor and town leaders to let them know that an outbreak is probably well underway. The entire town is placed in quarantine and locked down. Schools and businesses shut down, and children were instructed to stay inside. A call was sent out to the Public Health Department in Washington, D.C., and all medical establishments on the West Coast scrounged for a surplus supply of serum. Soon, a small supply was found in Anchorage. The challenge now would be to get it to Nome before the outbreak got worse. A plan was set in motion. The serum would be wrapped in a quilt and sent by express train from Anchorage to Nenana. Mushers along the 675-mile route from Nenana to Nome were given a warning order to stand ready to relay the serum west as soon as it arrived at the trailhead. The popular media has made heroes from the last 2 mushers in the relay. However, as any racer knows, there's a psychological advantage to finishing the race. It's starting that can be the hard part. And that start was done by Wild Bill Shannon, who ran 52 miles, starting with 9 Alaskan Malamutes. He picked up the serum from the train at 9 p.m. on January 27th and got instructions from the engineer to stop at roadhouses along the way to warm up the serum and keep it from freezing. The engineer recommended that he wait until morning to take off, when temperatures would be rising. But Bill responded, "If people are dying, let's get started." Bill and his dogs ran through the night as the temperatures fell from -40 to -62 Fahrenheit. At 3 a.m., frostbitten and with 3 dogs suffering from frostbitten lungs, he stopped at a roadhouse to rest for a short while, drop off his 3 wounded dogs, warm up the serum, and head back out with only 6 dogs. Those 3 dogs that he left behind would later die from overworking of their lungs in the frigid cold, and Wild Bill was permanently disfigured by his own frostbite. But he performed his mission with complete disregard for his own well-being or the life of his dogs. Over the next 4 days, 16 mushers followed the contours of the Yukon River out to the Norton Sound of the Bering Sea. Most of these mushers were native Athabascans. We only know their very anglicized and Russianized names and when they checked into each roadhouse, but for the most part, they did not receive radio coverage or news stories, and few photographs exist of these mushers and their dogs. The media instead seemed to gravitate toward the photogenic gold company men of Scandinavian stock who ran the final legs while overlooking these indigenous heroes who traversed some of the toughest miles. On January 28th, Edgar Callens took the serum from Bill Shannon and ran 31 miles against a 20-mile-per-hour wind as the temperatures warmed to -30. He passed the serum to Dan Green, who ran 28 miles to pass it to Johnny Folger, who ran through the night to pass the baton to Sam Joseph, who covered 26 miles in -38 degrees. On January 29th, Titus Nikolai mushed 34 miles, handed off to Dan Corning, who conveyed it to Harry Pitka. Then on to Bill McCarty, before Edgar Nollner passed it to his brother George, who set off on the morning of the 30th with the same dogs and sled that Edgar passed to him. George passed off to Charlie Evans, who passed to Tommy Patson, to Jack Nikolai, to Victor Anagik. On the 31st, Mild Gonigan passed off to Henry Ivanov, who handed it off to one of those Scandinavian gold company men. Each of these dog sled teams ran between 25 and 50 miles. 25 miles was at the time considered to be an extreme day's mush when conducted between 40 above and 40 below. It can be said that the men and dogs who ran these legs likely had different motivations than the ones I'm about to speak about. These men were part of an overall mission and did what they were good at to the best of their ability in order to facilitate a collective mission. The final mushers were probably a little bit more competitive. Okay, so part of me wants to skip over this because there's already a completely historically inaccurate Disney movie about these two, but despite all the fictional nonsense, Seppala and Togo were absolute superheroes. Seppala and Togo really are legendary. They covered more miles in less time than anyone. Far more miles. They actually did an out and back trip from Nome. Conservative accounts say that Seppala's team ran over 170 miles over 3 days with very little stops. Without clear instructions on a handoff, Seppala's team was running east at full speed across the frozen Norton Sound and actually ran past Ivanov, who was heading west with the serum. Luckily, Ivanov was able to flag down Seppala and hand off the serum. Team Togo popped a U-ing and headed west toward Nome. From there, Seppala runs 91 miles west across sea ice, darkness, a storm, and frigid weather. He hands it off to Charlie Olson, who moves it 25 miles and hands it off to Gunnar Kaysen. Kaysen, who was actually Seppala's assistant at the gold company and who borrowed dogs from Seppala's kennel, is the guy who runs into town with the lead dog Balto and takes outsized credit for his 55-mile run. At 5:30 in the morning, Kaysen pulls up to Dr. Welch's door with the serum. It's frozen solid and took another 5 hours to thaw, but it was enough to stave off the epidemic until the next serum run weeks later. In the end, the resilience of two species, dog and man, saved a handful of children in a tiny town on the edge of nowhere. As for other motivations, the first musher on the trail, Wild Bill Shannon, was also enticed to tour the lower 48 as a hero and clearly didn't care for that aspect. He and his dogs would agree. Proper bacon is the best motivator. To quote Bill, "This hero business is big blah. I want to get back where they shake hands and know how to fry bacon." A third motivation we should consider: to do a thing to see if it can be done. Both species show resilience in very similar ways. They train their bodies and minds to achieve inconceivable things, and in the end, each being has their own motivation that may be known only to them. Or maybe they don't know. Who knows? Regardless of motivations, humans and dogs owe their evolutionary prowess to a mutual resilience. As evidenced by this serum run, when these two species combine as a team, they are capable of far greater feats than they would be alone. So, here is a toast to the resilience of humans and dogs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt. To wrap up this evening's salon, Kate O'Donnell is coming to us from Oakland, and she'll be sharing a cautionary tale about syphilis and a story about the value of community in combating stigma.
Hi, I'm Kate O'Donnell, and I'm a fellow with the Odd Salon San Francisco chapter. Now tonight, I tell you a tale of patriarchy, prejudice, and perseverance, of stigma and solidarity, of obstacles and overcoming, and of the best retort to that annoying friend who's always talking about how they were born in the wrong era, untreatable syphilis. Described once by German humanist and syphilis sufferer Yusuf Grunpeck as, quote, so cruel, so distressing, so appalling that until now nothing more terrible or disgusting has ever been known on this earth. Aren't you excited to hear about this? I promise it gets better. Mostly because of the compassion of this guy, Mr. Crumpton, who had found a beautiful, unprecedented organization, the likes of which had never been seen, and the scene of which had never been liked. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Our tale begins in 18th, 19th century London, depending on who you ask. Despite the heterosexist prudishness often rightly associated with the era, people still had sex. A lot of sex. And while it's impossible to know the exact rate of syphilis at the time, basically, if you were sexually active between 1495 and the invention of penicillin in 1928, there's a good likelihood that you were hanging out with this little bugger, untreatable syphilis. Now, you'd be in great company with a lot of people who were alive in those times. Gauguin, Baudelaire, Toulouse-Lautrec, Manet, Tolstoy, Nietzsche, Lenin, Al Capone, Hitler, Mussolini, Schubert, Beethoven, Lincoln. Yeah, Lincoln. Maybe Winston Churchill's dad because of literally the worst prank ever, and millions of others, including a hell of a lot of people who didn't make it into the history books because they were not white men. So many that we have no idea, and will never have any idea, because the history of syphilis is a history of stigma and blame. Its very names ascribe blame. Not the word syphilis. That actually comes from a pretty effed up poem in which a shepherd named Syphilis calls out the sun god for killing his entire flock, and then is cursed with this horrible disease as a thanks for speaking truth to power. But it's other names, like seriously, history pro tip cheat sheet. If you want to know who was enemies with whom, just find out the colloquial name for syphilis. In France, it was the Neapolitan disease. In Naples, it was the French disease. In today's Italy, Germany, UK, it was also the French disease. In Russia, it was the Polish disease. In Poland, the German disease. The Danes, Portuguese, and North Africans called it the Spanish Castilian disease. The Turks called it the Christian disease. In northern India, it was the Hindus' fault, according to the Muslims, and the Muslims' fault, according to the Hindus, but at least everyone could agree that it was the European disease. Now, when it comes to the blame game, the name was just the tip of the iceberg. For many, the disease was public and unforgiving. While many fortunate carriers remained asymptomatic, many more suffered from painful, very visible sores, which, along with smallpox, is actually one of the reasons that pancake makeup and beauty marks became so fashionable at court. Worse, 15 to 30% of untreated cases had horrifying issues, including general paralysis of the insane and noselessness. One thing syphilis can do is degrade the nasal bone structure. You can actually see it here in the skull on the left. And in 18th, 19th century London, it's not like there's much you could do about it. Which brings us back to Mr. Crumpton. For one reason or another, he was fascinated with the noseless of London and decided to seek them out. From what we know, he spent part of the early 1700s, or late 1800s, depending on who you ask, but for this purpose, we're going to go with the former, strolling around town and basically just rolling up on people missing their noses and telling them that if they would just meet him at the Dog Tavern on Drury Lane at a certain day and time, he'd tell them a secret. Not weird at all. How many people did he find? Well, probably plenty, because... Okay, hold on, Mr. Crumpton. We'll get back to you in just a second. See, in 18th century London, it's not like there's much you could do about not having a nose. It was syphilis that birthed the first rhinoplasty, but the best thing they could do at the time was this gruesome skin graft from your arm, requiring you to be in a cast like this for 40 days, all of which could be lost should you succumb to a violent bout of sneezing. The other option was a prosthesis, like this one made by the Royal College of Surgeons in Victoria-era London, for a woman who contracted syphilis from her dirtbag husband after he cheated on her, then told her she wasn't pretty enough anymore and made her wear this hunkin' thing around all day. That's not really a picture of her husband, but I felt like it was accurate enough. In addition to being a cumbersome metal device you had to wear on your face, prostheses were very expensive, which means if you lost your nose to syphilis, you just didn't have a nose. So our Mr. Crumpton probably spoke to a lot of folks, and I just can't imagine how that conversation would go, because we know Mr. Crumpton was well-bred. So there you are, suffering from syphilis, missing a nose, when some gentleman comes up to you, and even if it's a slightly weird invitation, he wants to talk. And the other reason why that would be so unusual is that these people's disfigurement was not the only reason they were outcasts. To add the worst insult to the worst injury, if you lost your nose to syphilis, not only would you have to suffer the day-to-day of being treated like a monster, your quote-unquote monstrosity is something you deserved. Because that is, let's be real, the extra fun in having a sexually transmitted infection. You were a sinner, and this was your punishment. And yes, this is a woodcut of Jesus punishing sinners with evil syphilis rays. Charming, I know. And because morality has always been used as a tool to condemn what the ruling class fears, not only were you a sinner if you had it, a woman was unpure if her lady brain even knew about the existence of the disease. Which is why, if you were among those approached by Mr. Crumpton, it must have seemed so particularly odd for a well-heeled gentleman to treat you like a person. So, who was this guy with the secret for the noseless of London? Well, we know he was either a resident or frequenter of Covent Garden, an area particularly known at the time for its sex work. Now, I have a long rant that goes here about feminism and sex workers and how it's always women's fault. In fact, did you know that our vaginas can actually be agents of Hitler? Hashtag no medicine for regret. Because, hey, we may look like goddesses, but our private parts are actually demonic agents of man-eating death. Which is why so many sex workers were condemned to lock hospitals and workhouses if they were suspected of having an STI in the 1800s. And there's so much more here, and we don't have time for it, but dear God, if you're jonesing for a feminist rant, I am your gal. Back to Mr. Crumpton. We don't know a lot about him. We do know that he did have a nose, and though there were no visible symptoms, it's pretty likely he was suffering from some sort of disease. Don't know much else, though. We do know that that was not his name. Crumpton was an alias, and we also know that that was not his face. There's really very little known about this guy. This is a picture of a random dude I found on the internet, but he looks really nice, right? So, what we do know comes from Ned Ward, pub owner and publisher of the London Spy, and his 1709 Guide to London Clubs. Now, en vogue at the time were gentlemen's clubs, which I always think of as looking something like this, and really wished looked like this, and were probably actually more like this, where people named Mr. Dumpley read boring papers. That said, the club about to form was anything but boring. See, that was the secret Mr. Crumpton was talking about. He was forming a club, one where, in the words of Ned Ward, people could, quote, show their scandalous vizards in one noseless society. When the appointed day of secret-telling time came, Crumpton put in an order for a feast at the Dog Tavern and warned the staff not to be too surprised at the appearance of his guests. At the appointed hour, the guests arrived and were ushered upstairs from the bar to their own private gathering area. Now, according to this account, none of the attendees had any idea what secret they were coming for, and were really surprised to find out that the secret was joining a group of people who looked like themselves. As Ned writes, quote, as the number increased, the surprise grew the greater among all that were present, who stared at one another with such unaccustomed bashfulness and confused oddness, as if every sinner beheld their own iniquities in the faces of their companions. Now let's just pause for a second to imagine what walking into a welcome community filled with people who looked like them must have been like for these folks. The street they'd just come from was filled with people who treated them like monsters. To this day, those without a nose are depicted as demons. Perhaps there's an association with snakes demonized in Christian theology, I don't know. But I think surgeon Johann Friedrich Diefenbach captured it accurately in an 1890 surgical text when he wrote, quote, "A blind man arouses pity, but a person without a nose creates repulsion and horror. And what's more, the world is still used to regarding this unfortunate disfigurement as a punishment. The unfortunate man who has lost his nose enjoys no pity at all, least of all from bigots, homeopaths, and hypocrites." Stepping in from the cruel outside world, all of a sudden these folks were not only not demonized, they were celebrated. Their faces transformed from marks of stigma to the commonality shared between a community. And in the safety of this community, humor blossomed. At one point, the cook sent down 2 pigs ordered for the feast, and in jest had cut off the snouts. Crumpton was not pleased, but everyone else began joking about it. As Ned wrote, quote, "And then they began to jest and be merry with one another's iniquities, as if their sufferings were their glory." And thus was born the No Nose Club. Yes, its actual name. As far as we know, after this first auspicious gathering, they decided to meet monthly. And today we're pretty accustomed to group meetings from those suffering from the same disease, from alcoholism to AIDS, but let us not forget how revolutionary that idea is, especially with an STI like syphilis enshrouded by society with shame. Something that's your fault for having because you're a sinner, something respectable ladies can't even know exists. To this day, syphilis is still incredibly stigmatized. I mean, in a sense, it's that stigma preventing folks from being tested that is one of the reasons it's even still around the extent that it is. But by 1709, at least one group of people got it right. We think. Was the No Nose Club real? For the sake of historical accuracy, it's worth noting a couple things here. A, there was a very similar version of this story reported in multiple papers about 100 years later. Either someone read the 1709 account, was inspired to do the same thing, and assumed the very similar name Mr. Crampton, or it was simply old news recycled. B, Ned Ward, writer of the 1709 account, was published in a variety of genres, but one of the ones he was well known for was satire. C, that said, multiple well-respected historians have taken Ned at his word and published this account of the No Nose Club. Either way, there is no debate that the 1700s saw the origin of certain types of medical support groups. So, I'm going to leave the length of Mr. Crumpton's nose up to you. To finish this account, the final meeting of this iteration of the No Nose Club was sadly at Mr. Crumpton's funeral, less than a year after the first meeting, upon which members of the club delivered a eulogy that begins, quote, "Mourn all ye no-nosed, the fairest face." The power of solidarity and the acceptance of people as fellow human beings cannot be overstated. It even goes beyond the interpersonal. Who wants to support research for diseases that only monsters and sinners get? Obviously, no one should ever be othered. No one should ever have to wear a heavy, expensive prosthesis on their face in order to be loved. Which is where, actually, we're going to end. Remember a friend who owned this, the woman with a dirtbag husband? There's a reason the Royal College of Surgeons has this prosthesis. We don't know who she was, but we do know that her rotten husband died, likely of syphilis. She met someone else, they fell in love, they got married, upon which she returned this to the Royal College of Surgeons, and when they asked her why she was returning it, she said it was because her new partner loved her just the way she was. And so, I would like to give a toast to the power of solidarity. Whether it's treating your loved ones with respect, forming a club, or making medical masks with your housemates in your living room. Don't let the assholes get you down, because you are not alone. Cheers.
We chose the phoenix for the symbol of resilience for this evening, but there were other options. The tardigrade, for example, nature's nearly immortal ultimate survivors, live all over the world, from hot springs to the Himalayas. They're the first known animals to survive exposure to space. They have excellent prospects for being a protagonist as a microscopic version of I Am Legend, and they are also known as moss piglets. We also thought about using the Yeti crab. It's a blind crustacean who can endure extreme water pressure, no sunlight, and the depths of up to 2,300 feet below sea level. They live on the edge of the Antarctic Sea at the boiling water coming from underwater vents. They're also known as Hoff crabs after Michael Hasselhoff's chest hair. We also briefly considered this very sassy cockroach in a top hat, thank you Isolde, shown here on date night after the end times. We also thought about other kinds of human resilience, how overwintering in Antarctica either breaks you or makes you stronger, or both, like a frozen hell version of the Nietzsche saying. But tonight, we specifically wanted to look at the resilience of individuals and communities who faced plagues and pandemics, who went through the flames, but who instead of breaking, bent. Each one of these outbreaks revealed devastation and loss, stories of survival and endurance, and the surprising constant motif of resilience. Historically, for all of you who've been at Odd Salon over the years, you know that we've never shied away from stories of death and disease. We've hosted whole salons dedicated to the themes of doomed and epidemic. As readers of history, we understand that no matter what the news says, this is not a unique moment in time, that this is one that communities have endured before, part of a continuum. There have been pandemics over and over again throughout history, and there will be again. And we should all be very glad that we are not now living in the 14th century. Speaking of the 14th century, perhaps during the darkest moment in human history, a young man from Florence fled the ravages of the Black Death. The Black Death tore through Europe from 1347 to 1351. The bubonic plague was a virus, much like the one that we're facing now. However, the mortality rate was between 30 and 50%. In the city of Florence alone, the city population was cut in half, from over 100,000 to just 50,000 in just 1 year. Giovanni Boccaccio survived. He returned to Florence, and in 1352, he published the work that would make him famous, the Decameron. The story is set in the countryside overlooking Florence, and the story follows 10 young people fleeing the ravages of the plague, quarantining themselves in a villa. In order to pass the time, they told distracting stories to each other for each day for 10 days, resulting in a collection of 100 stories. And you would think, because this is during the Black Death, that these stories would be sad, they would be morbid, but they're not dark at all. They're funny and ribald and sexy and a little scandalous. They were distractions for the plague exiles. It was the 14th century equivalent of binging on Tiger King. That book, written nearly 500 years ago, was a hit. It was a bestseller in the years that followed the plague. It's been translated into languages around the world. It's been illustrated by the world's finest illustrators and greatest artists. It's been reimagined as theater, and it is still in print. In fact, it is tonight's speaker's book. The Decameron was Boccaccio's Phoenix, born of the fires of 1348. So tonight, as we've listened to these stories of resilience, I want to challenge all of you to a takeaway. I want you to think about what it is that is the phoenix that we would like to see, personally and as communities, to arise from these flames. Because, as history has shown, even if it feels that way right now, this won't actually last forever. And so as we close the salon, I'd like to turn to a story as told by the 12th century Sufi poet Attar of Nishapur. The story says that a sultan requested that his viziers provide him with a saying to be inscribed upon a ring, which would make him happy when he is sad and sad when he is happy. The viziers went away and they thought and they pondered and they considered the options and they came back to him with a ring inscribed with a phrase that is echoed through time. And that is the thing that I would like to raise our glass at the end of the night as we look forward to the phoenix that we're going to find emerging from these flames. So please join me and tonight's speakers in raising a glass to the immortal. We chose the phoenix for the symbol of resilience for this evening, but there were other options. The tardigrade, for example, nature's nearly immortal ultimate survivors, live all over the world, from hot springs to the Himalayas. They're the first known animals to survive exposure to space. They have excellent prospects for being a protagonist as a microscopic version of I Am Legend, and they are also known as moss piglets. We also thought about using the Yeti crab. It's a blind crustacean who can endure extreme water pressure, no sunlight, and the depths of up to 2,300 feet below sea level. They live on the edge of the Antarctic Sea at the boiling water coming from underwater vents. They're also known as Hoff crabs after Michael Hasselhoff's chest hair. We also briefly considered this very sassy cockroach in a top hat, thank you Isolde, shown here on date night after the end times. We also thought about other kinds of human resilience, how overwintering in Antarctica either breaks you or makes you stronger, or both, like a frozen hell version of the Nietzsche saying. But tonight, we specifically wanted to look at the resilience of individuals and communities who faced plagues and pandemics, who went through the flames, but who instead of breaking, bent. Each one of these outbreaks revealed devastation and loss, stories of survival and endurance, and the surprising, constant motif of resilience. Historically, for all of you who've been at Odd Salon over the years, you know that we've never shied away from stories of death and disease. We've hosted whole salons dedicated to the themes of doomed and epidemic. As readers of history, we understand that no matter what the news says, this is not a unique moment in time, that this is one that communities have endured before, part of a continuum. There have been pandemics over and over again throughout history, and there will be again. And we should all be very glad that we are not now living in the 14th century. Speaking of the 14th century, perhaps during the darkest moment in human history, a young man from Florence fled the ravages of the Black Death. The Black Death tore through Europe from 1347 to 1351. The bubonic plague was a virus, much like the one that we're facing now. However, the mortality rate was between 30 and 50%. In the city of Florence alone, the city population was cut in half, from over 100,000 to just 50,000 in just 1 year. Giovanni Boccaccio survived. He returned to Florence, and in 1352, he published the work that would make him famous, the Decameron. The story is set in the countryside overlooking Florence, and the story follows 10 young people fleeing the ravages of the plague, quarantining themselves in a villa. In order to pass the time, they told distracting stories to each other for each day for 10 days, resulting in a collection of 100 stories. And you would think, because this is during the Black Death, that these stories would be sad, they would be morbid, but they're not dark at all. They're funny and ribald and sexy and a little scandalous. They were distractions for the plague exiles. It was the 14th century equivalent of binging on Tiger King. That book, written nearly 500 years ago, was a hit. It was a bestseller in the years that followed the plague. It's been translated into languages around the world. It's been illustrated by the world's finest illustrators and greatest artists. It's been reimagined as theater, and it is still in print. In fact, it is tonight's speaker's book. The Decameron was Boccaccio's Phoenix, born of the fires of 1348. So tonight, as we've listened to these stories of resilience, I want to challenge all of you to a takeaway. I want you to think about what it is that is the phoenix that we would like to see, personally and as communities, to arise from these flames. Because, as history has shown, even if it feels that way right now, this won't actually last forever. And so as we close the salon, I'd like to turn to a story as told by the 12th century Sufi poet Attar of Nishapur. The story says that a sultan requested that his viziers provide him with a saying to be inscribed upon a ring, which would make him happy when he is sad and sad when he is happy. The viziers went away and they thought and they pondered and they considered the options and they came